Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new GeoPodcast of Geopolitical Cyprus.org. We are very happy today to have with us Caroline Rose, Europe and Middle East Analyst at Geopolitical Futures. She's an expert in the region. Caroline, welcome and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so we were thinking about discussing various important and interesting issues around Syria today. And let's get right to it by listening your thoughts on what is the situation maybe on the ground and regarding the spheres of influence between specifically the United States and Russia. We know that the United States have been limited in some way to the east of Syria, and Russia is obviously controlling the western part and central part with the Syrian government. And we know that recently there has been some friction between the two in terms of areas of control. How do you see that playing out, and who do you see maybe getting the upper hand in the months and maybe years to follow?
Great question. A question a lot of people who are following Syria are asking themselves. So Syria has been for the past 9 years. It's been a battle space for geopolitical competition, for outside powers that are wanting to gain access to the Mediterranean, for entrenched powers within the region that are also trying to gain a foothold, whether military, economic, or political, in the Levant. And then, of course, a battle between the Syrians themselves, between the regime, between rebel groups, between different factions that have emerged since 2011. And so Syria has really emerged as this theater, as this space where you have Russia, you have the United States, you have Turkey, you have Iran, and then you have all these different fragmented, different militias and these different groups that are trying to gain a foothold and trying to vie for influence. Now, for Russia and for Turkey, Syria is an excellent space to project influence and to try and get a coastal footprint, particularly in Latakia or Tartus, where they can be able to project influence into the Mediterranean. Turkey's already doing this with Libya and, of course, with recent developments that we've heard with Greece and Cyprus. And so Syria is also another step in Turkey's strategy. For Russia as well, Russia, of course, is looking for warm water port access. And Syria is an excellent place. They had a pre-existing relationship with the Assad regime before, and so they're trying to build off of that relationship and essentially make themselves the kingmaker in Syrian politics and geopolitics. Iran, of course, is trying to expand its Shiite crescent, make a land bridge into the Mediterranean through proxy groups, through economic networks, through political influence, and try and establish a foothold there. And then the United States, looking at all of this, looking at the geopolitical differences and seeing Syria as a key buffer between some of its allies in the Middle East, between the Gulf, between Turkey, and of course, looking at Russian participation. They've looked to leverage against the regime, leverage against Russian gains, and then of course, leverage against extremist groups such as Daesh, that have made some considerable advances on the ground. Now, of course, Daesh doesn't have the foothold that it had a few years ago, but of course, the United States, they still have a few units in the east trying to stave ISIS from being able to get any oil fields or financial assets or make any gains against the Kurds. So that's the picture. But in the past year, we've seen the sand shifting. The United States has started to make some moves in Iraq with withdrawals from certain major bases, indicating that the United States is changing its strategy, it's recalibrating its purpose in the Middle East, its imperatives really. And you're starting to see the United States transfer some of their major bases along the Syrian-Iraqi border to the Iraqi security forces. You're also starting to see the United States reconsider its footprint in the Northeast, Of course, last October, we saw the United States make a series of base transfers, not necessarily to the Kurds, but in Kurdish-held regions, allowing Turkey to also further engage and further push into this peace, what they call this peace corridor in the north. And so you're starting to see the United States shift its posture in Syria and Iraq. We're seeing that right now as we speak in Iraq. They're trying to renegotiate the status of forces there. And I expect we're going to see the same in Syria. And it is going to be an incremental, backdoor, somewhat of a quiet process where the United States is going to reduce its footprint there. Simply because the focus has changed. The United States, when they first deployed many of these units, they were there to fight Daesh. But really counter Iranian groups and Iranian proxies that were crossing from the Iraqi border into Syria. And certainly while Iranian influence is alive and well in Syria, the United States, it's starting to look towards more conventional foes such as China and Russia. And I think a lot of officials at the Pentagon are starting to get a little bit weary with the engagement that they have in Syria, and they haven't seen many gains. Especially with all of these different actors becoming involved. Of course, we're seeing Turkey become more involved. Russia, of course, still has a very strong footprint in the country, and they're in many ways running the Assad regime. They're running the show and trying to leverage Assad against different actors that they want to be in power. So I think that the United States is looking at Syria right now and asking the question of, okay, how long? What's worth it? What can we leverage? And we've already made this pretty large withdrawal in October of 2019. Do we build up? And if so, what's the strategy there? And really, Turkey's technically an ally, but how much can we trust them if we want to leverage the Kurds against the Assad regime? We can't necessarily count on them to cooperate with the Kurds. So right now, you're seeing this massive shift in the United States strategy. And I think that if we do see a deficit of US leadership, let alone US presence in the Northeast, you're going to see a massive scramble between Iran, Turkey, different Kurdish and rebel groups, extremist militias as well. And you're going to see the Northeast become the new battle space.
Well, that was a very good and concise overview of the situation on the ground. Yanis, I think you might have a follow-up on that.
What I really like to know and see Caroline's take on that is how the whole situation around Idlib and the final phase of the Syrian conflict would accelerate this vacuum that was already described regarding the US presence on the Syrian ground and the competition between the Iranian proxies and, of course, Russia. I mean, is this going to happen after an outcome, an endgame in Idlib, or before? I mean, is it a dynamic process, or is it something that we have to wait? What's going to be the fate, the outcome of the Syrian conflict?
It's a great question. Idlib is one of the most puzzling elements of the Syrian civil war right now, because it has become so entangled with other conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean. So now when you talk about Idlib, you're also talking about a ceasefire in Libya. You're also talking about, Turkish-Russian tensions in the Caucasus, and it has become intertwined with a lot of different conflicts and tensions in the region. So because of that, I think that Idlib is a more protracted theater where you're going to see a lot more gridlock, which is why I think that in the Northeast, if something opens up, if the United States starts to really reduce its presence, really reduce its military footprint in the Northeast, I think you'll see a scramble there before you'll see a scramble in Idlib. Because Idlib, the Russian and the Turkish strategy has always been there's tension, you try to de-escalate, you try and minimize any potential for clashes, and you push each other until you can renegotiate the ceasefire again. And so we saw that back in, March, which feels like eons ago, feels like 3 years ago for me, where Turkey and Russia renegotiated the existing ceasefire over Idlib. And Russia primarily and the Syrian regime, they were the so-called winners of the ceasefire because they got a bit more territory, and they were allowed to retain a lot of the territory and advances that they made in February and January. That being said, of course, Turkey wants another attempt at renegotiation to retain the territory, but also to expand its footprint further east, where it has this peace corridor that it's retained for economic influence, for repatriating Syrian refugees, for trying to project more Turkish influence into the country. So that's essentially the strategy that both countries have in Idlib. I don't necessarily expect Idlib to be renegotiated in the next few months, but I do expect Idlib to become a flashpoint once again, like it was earlier this winter. Because again, both countries, the system can't stay. It can't stick. There's too much tension. Both sides have diabolically different strategies and endgames in the country. And so it can't stay that way. Assad won't accept, a Syria that is not unified under its forces, and same with Syria as its security guarantor. So it simply cannot stay that way. So expect, I think, in the next year another flashpoint emerging in Idlib, and both sides trying to pressure each other and renegotiate this existing agreement that they have.
Yeah,
you want to add something on that?
Yeah. Just before coming to you, because I know you have a question, I just wanted to go back to something that Caroline mentioned before and ask, I mean, Caroline, to what degree do you think that there is a connection between what Turkey and Russia are doing in Idlib and this communication and maybe a give and take relationship that they have, this transactional, if you will, relationship that they have there, trying to manage the crisis, as you said, to what is happening in Libya, because many analysts suggested that these two sort of fronts and these two case studies are somehow connected. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that especially with Turkey, they're really trying to connect it, because if you look at what's going on in Libya, Turkey's backing of the Government of National Accord, the GNA, they've made some considerable and in some cases surprising territorial gains from the West. And that push towards Sirte and Jufra has allowed Turkey to have somewhat of an upper hand in Libya. And so they want to translate that into the gridlock in Idlib and try and get Russia to get back to the negotiating table and not only produce a ceasefire on Libya with the Libyan National Army, the LNA, but also try and renegotiate the March ceasefire agreement with Russia. Russia, of course, has a more indirect status in Libya. They have Wagner Group mercenaries. Of course, they supply the Haftar's Libyan National Army with arms and political support and financial support, but they don't have the foothold that they have in Syria. So I think Russia, their agenda right now is trying to keep it separate, and Libya is trying to, intertwine both of them. I don't necessarily agree with many analysts who say that both are exactly the same. Because the power dynamics are completely different. And on top of that, you have more European countries willing to engage and to participate in the Libyan civil war, where many of them try and keep, a 10-foot pole between Europe and Syria. That's a conflict that many European countries are not necessarily willing to become entrenched in. So I think both, they're separate. One power is trying to intertwine both of them and try and make them synonymous. And Russia is trying its best to keep both separate and of course entertain Turkish proposals for dialogue, but at the same time, keep them separate because they have a way more of an advantage in Syria than they do in Libya right now.
Yanni, I think you would like to take the last question. It's about the important issue on Syria.
Yes. So let's go to this factor we discussed in the beginning about the drug routes around Syria and how Syria is connected to a modern day type of drug called Captagon, this type of amphetamine that is very popular among fighting groups in all types of ideology, but it's mostly on public sphere, according to international media, is called as the jihadi drug. Recently, we had a big success by the Italian authorities. It was a combined operation by both the Italian Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Europol, as long as the Italian police. And it was a huge load, maybe the biggest load ever captured in the history of drug trafficking around Europe, of Captagon. Caroline, would you like to give us some insights about drugs in Syria, since your experience in an investigative level on this?
Absolutely. So all of last year, I was involved with the London School of Economics International Drug Policy Unit. We call it IDPU. And we recently did a project on exploring Captagon in Syria specifically, a bit around Lebanon as well. And we did some field research, not necessarily to Syria, but we did a lot in Lebanon, where we looked at the effects and the transnational effects of the Captagon trade in Syria and its spillover into the Levant. And you're absolutely right. Captagon is an issue that is prevalent in Syria, but at the same time, not necessarily explored. And on top of that, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the drug itself, and then also about the actors that produce, circulate, and use the drug. So since 2015, Captagon hit the media, and a lot of news outlets essentially covered the issue by saying that it was the jihadist drug, and that it was mostly circulated by actors like Daesh, and then other, for example, al-Nusra and other very jihadist organizations that operated in Syria and elsewhere. There is evidence of extremist use of Captagon, and because of the feasibility of producing Captagon, a lot of different militias and actors have been able to produce it and essentially fund their activities through Captagon revenues. However, I think that it's very skewed towards ISIS use of Captagon and production of Captagon. So for example, the recent seizure that you mentioned about Italy taking, I think it was the largest amphetamine seizure in history. It was, I think, I have it down here, it's like 14 metric tons, 84 million tablets. Incredible. The size was just, if you look at the videos, they were pouring these pills, and it looked like a never-ending sea of amphetamines that were seized by the Italian authorities in Naples. And immediately after, the Italian authorities were quick to accredit ISIS for being the actor that sent these shipments to Italy. And a lot of analysts raise their eyebrows over that statement, just because the sheer size and scope of that operation, not only just the fact that it was 14 metric tons, but sending it to Italy across the Mediterranean, through shipments, through Italian shipments as well. That was very skeptical. ISIS cannot perform an operation that requires that much infrastructure. ISIS, of course, as many people know, in Syria, they're very much cornered into the northeast, where they don't have much sea access. The shipment was apparently tracked from Latakia, the port of Latakia, which is a regime-held, in some cases Russian-leased, Iranian-leased base on the coast of Syria. ISIS has no access to that base. And there was this really excellent piece by, I think his name Christoph Reuters, for Der Spiegel, who performed this excellent investigation on how this doesn't exactly line up, and how it actually points more towards the Assad regime as one of the primary circulators of Captagon. They're the only actor, even taking into account Hezbollah's history with Captagon and marijuana and whatnot. They have infrastructural capability of doing this, but really the regime does, because they have the business, they have the factories, they have the infrastructure, they have the connections to try out a drug shipment this size. And
they really need, sorry for interrupting, and they really need money, especially in this timing under the Caesars Act and under the COVID pandemic and the downfall of the Syrian lira. So it's really important to highlight this.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's the big question that when we sat down and started doing this research before, there weren't a lot of connections, and all the connections were fuzzy. And I will preface this and say that all of the research on Captagon, a lot of it isn't necessarily concrete, because we're talking about Syria, where field research isn't necessarily possible, and on top of that, a lot of the networks and a lot of the dark web trades that happen on the black web, or even day-to-day transactions, that can't necessarily be recorded. Even seizure data is not necessarily publicized by certain countries. We have a lot of data from the Gulf. Saudi Arabia does some excellent lab tests, but not all countries do that. And not all of the Middle Eastern countries cooperate with each other or share this information. So it's a very difficult process of trying to track and see which groups are engaged, which governmental officials are engaged, which ones are not. And so, of course, this recent investigation, I don't want to call it speculation, but again, like, there's nothing absolutely concrete. However, they did find that not only was the ship from Latakia, but a lot of the containers, like the paper containers, the cylinders that they were stored in, they were produced in factories that had connections to the Assad regime, either by being Assad's uncle, and then on top of that, there was a businessman who had this paper manufacturing company. He just opened it in Aleppo, so it was not on the U.S. sanctions list. And that was likely the destination for where they packaged these Captagon shipments. So I really do agree with you. The Syrian regime is facing a dire currency crisis. They are really in the red. And so because of that, you turn to a drug trade that has been prevalent in the country since the beginning of the civil war. And you look on that, you capitalize it, and you make it more of an industrialized trade. And so, the destination was Europe this time. Usually it's the Gulf. That was another puzzling thing for many Captagon analysts. Usually the Gulf is the primary destination region, because it's a very popular drug there. People in Europe don't necessarily use Captagon. Captagon's an interesting drug as well, just because it's evolved from its original formula, and the lack of precursors in the area and the lack of funds to really stick to the original formula. You've had this whole different formula evolve, a mishmash of codeine and paracetamol and caffeine and phenethylene and theophylline and all these different ingredients that can have some major health effects, negative health effects. And so typically you don't necessarily see the Captagon shipments reach Europe, but it's the time of COVID, so I guess different demand during these times.
Yeah,
fantastic. Zenonas, you want to ask something last, or let's?
No, actually, I'm covered. I mean, that was very interesting. Caroline, thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed it. It was very good to have you with us. And I hope that we'll get the chance to speak again and do another podcast together.
Too. Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. This was great.
Yeah. Dear all, we'll make sure that you'll be able to access the full details about Caroline's profile and work in the description box, both on Facebook and the YouTube. Please stay tuned with geopoliticalcyprus.org. Keep tracking and following us on social media and anywhere else you can find us. We'll be in touch and trying to follow up on everything that's going on in the region. Thank you for watching, and stay well. Bye-bye.